Do you think there is a risk that the impacts hit even richer countries and they realize this problem is coming home to them, that many people will think, well, we need this money ourselves, let's look after ourselves in a dangerous world? It seems some of the aid is very tenuous, aid as it exists is arbitrary, there's no obligation to give it, people give it, but it can be shifted around. Is this money for adaptation going to be any different? Will governments be just as likely to shift it to their favourite countries or withdraw it and say, we're in hard times, we can't afford aid, whether it's for climate or development?
Well, I think there's this fundamental distinction between money provided under the Framework Convention from the polluting countries to the victim countries for assisting them in adaptation, from aid which is given by the rich to the poor out of a sense of charity, with no obligations attached. The self-imposed obligation or target of 0.7% of gross domestic income has been met by some countries, not met by other countries. There's no penalty involved. They give themselves time extensions. These are self-imposed penalties. There's no agreement. Whereas the Framework Convention is a treaty. So my own personal view is that the more we can have commitments locked in under the Framework Convention, the better. And funding for funds under the Framework Convention, and we actually have a very good example for adaptation funding, which is called the adaptation levy on the clean development mechanism, which is a creation of the Kyoto Protocol. So every time there's a transaction between a developed and a developing country entity to trade carbon or carbon reductions, 2% of that transaction is put into a fund called the Adaptation Fund, which is now governed by a governing body set up by the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol parties. So one of the proposals that we have, which in my view is a very interesting and innovative proposal from the least developed countries, is to apply similar adaptation levy on international air travel. So every international air passenger traveling would pay $5 or $10, depending on the class of travel, into a fund that would go to an adaptation fund. Now that is not at the whim of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK or the Finance Minister of France or Germany or the US anymore. That's independently collected. It's a global tax on a global citizen for a global activity for a global good. And the more we can get those kinds of what I would term innovative funding mechanisms in place, the more we are out of the whims of finance ministers who have to bow to their electorates who don't want to give money away when in times, whether they're good or bad, they don't like giving money away.
But I understand there's a proposal floating around the conference as well for a similar levy on shipping. But in reality, what are the prospects for such levies to be accepted? Presumably the Western countries, or some of them, are going to say, well, we don't like levies, we don't like taxation, this is on specific areas, we'll have a carbon tax, or it'll be a different carbon pricing and the money will go there. Are they realistic? Do they have a chance of being accepted?
Well, I'll give you my own personal opinion, which is that I've been tracking this for some time and I see the chances getting better by the day. And I'll tell you why. Firstly, as we get to the crunch and finance ministers and treasuries from developed countries are being asked to fork out significant sums of money in the tens of billions of dollars to the climate change issue to solve the climate change problem, they are finding it very difficult, particularly in a recession-hit economy, to find that money out of taxpayer money. So now they extremely dislike any kind of levying and ring fencing of funds. They want to be the sole taxers on their citizens. On the other hand, this may be the least bad option. If money has to be found, well, if everybody agrees, let the passengers pay, as long as then it's not coming out of our taxpayer funds. All the international passengers are paying. And interestingly, the LDC proposal does not say only the rich passengers or the rich countries pay. It's everybody pays, even the least developed country. A Bangladeshi flying from Bangladesh to Delhi will pay it as much as an American flying from Washington to London. And so it is levied at the level of the individual rather than countries. And in my view, a much fairer levy in that sense.
Have we got time for an intervention from outer space there, from the blogosphere?
Definitely. Saleem, we only have a few minutes left, but we have a really interesting question here from Ken in Fresno, California. He says, what effect will global warming have, if gone unchecked, on island countries? And then he says, I visit the Philippines yearly, and some of the fishing villages have already moved 20 feet or more away from the ocean due to oceans rising. And then he goes on and he says, in addition, when I'm diving, I notice that there's a much greater increase in the number of jellyfish, and especially as the crown star of thorns, which destroy coral reefs. So what is the impact that you're seeing on islands? And we just have about a minute or two left.
Well, island countries and coral reefs in particular are like the canary in the coal mine of global warming. They're the first to go. Sea level is one of the most inevitable and physically unstoppable activities that will take place because of global warming. Temperatures rising, the sea will rise, the oceans will expand, the ice will melt. We can't stop it. We can't make it unmelt. So low-lying countries, particularly countries like Tuvalu and in the Pacific, Kiribati in the Pacific, Maldives in the Indian Ocean, are particularly vulnerable. Not all island countries are that low-lying. There are a few only, and that produces a very important impact on the rest of the world, in that if we carry on unchecked, we are basically writing off these countries off the face of the earth, knowingly. And that's really what we hope that these leaders coming to Copenhagen will realize and say, that ain't right, and we're not going to let it happen.
We've got to wrap up, but just squeeze in one thought on that. That at the conference, the small island states are suggesting that the aim should be to hold temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, and the general consensus is a 2-degree target. Is that going to be a problem at the conference?
Well, that is something that alludes to my previous answer, which is that a 2-degree temperature rise is deemed by many countries to be a dangerous level that we should not go over. That may well be the case if we define dangerous as globally dangerous. On the other hand, 2 degrees rise will cause local problems. As I mentioned, Tuvalu and the Maldives suffered significantly with 2 degrees. And therefore, the island countries are the ones that are pushing for a 1.5 degree target for setting the dangerous limit, because the difference between a 1.5 and 2 for many of them is their very existence. Now, the rest of the world may say, well, a few islands we can let them go, but that's a conscious decision that the rest of the world is making. And if they really wish to do that, then I think we live in a very, very bad world.
Well, thank you very much, I think, and thank you out there, everybody, from Twitterers and everybody else for sending in questions. Keep them coming. Just to remind you, it's OneClimate.net at Copenhagen, and we've been talking to Saleemul Huq from the International Institute for Environment and Development. We've run out of time, but just so that if people are interested, they could look up the institution in Bangladesh that you're setting up. Just tell us what it is, and people can look for it on the web.
Okay, it's called the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and it's going to be set up at the Independent University in Bangladesh. And the idea is to develop capacity on climate change, particularly adaptation in developing countries.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Saleemul Huq, and we'll perhaps persuade you to come back in the second week and see how we're getting on. Thanks a lot.